Sometimes, when people hear stories about sexual violence, the first reaction is pure rage. Because it's not just the crime itself, it's what comes after. The fear, the silence, the disbelief. And too often, the lack of justice. Today's stories aren't here to glamorize revenge. They're here to show what can happen when someone feels cornered, ignored, or failed by the system, whether those choices lead to consequences, controversy, or lifelong aftermath. These are 10 real cases and legends, often discussed in history and media, where women responded in extreme ways after sexual violence or threats. Let's get into it. Number 10. Jackie Clarke. In the early 2000s, in Britain, one name started spreading across tabloids and online retellings: Jackie Clarke. Not because she wanted attention, but because of what she was accused of doing to a man she claimed had harmed her in the past. Now, before we go further, one thing matters. This story has been repeated widely online, but reliable public reporting is limited, and the name Jackie Clarke is connected to multiple unrelated people and casiso. Some details may be inconsistent depending on the source. Still, the reason this story won't disappear isn't about perfect details. It's about what it represents. According to commonly repeated accounts, Jackie invited the man to her home. It didn't look like a trap at first, a normal room, a normal moment. Then the story claims the man was drugged, restrained with help, and assaulted, punished in a way meant to leave a permanent message. Not just pain, a mark, because revenge isn't always about ending someone. Sometimes it's about making sure they can never hide again. But no matter what Jackie believed, she was avenging. The law doesn't label it justice. In the UK, assault is still assault, and prosecutions are built around legal definitions, not personal history or emotional certainty. Later, Jackie was prosecuted, and when questioned, she reportedly claimed she didn't remember parts of what happened. Then she said the line that keeps getting repeated: "If I did it, I did it." 4 words. Not denial, not panic, just something cold and final, like she'd already made peace with the consequences. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one woman and one victim. Because revenge doesn't come from confidence. It comes from powerlessness. It comes from feeling ignored, dismissed, or failed by systems that are supposed to protect people. And that's not just a feeling. Rape case outcomes and survivor experiences have been heavily scrutinized in the UK, including through official reviews of how these cases are handled. But here's the truth. The internet version doesn't tell you. Revenge doesn't heal trauma. It adds more damage. It adds police courts, headlines, prison time, and a second identity. Not just survivor, but offender. So whether every detail of this story is perfectly accurate or not, the warning underneath it is clear. When justice doesn't arrive in time, desperation sometimes does. And that's how a victim becomes a headline. Number 9. Sonnet Ehlers and the Rypaks. This one isn't a revenge story that happens after the fact. It's revenge, designed in advance. A consequence built into a warning. A message meant to be delivered the moment someone tries to take what doesn't belong to them. And it starts in South Africa with a woman who spent years listening to survivors. Her name was Sonnet Ehlers. She worked in healthcare, and she heard story after story, women walking in shaken, terrified, trying to explain something that never should have happened. But what stayed with her wasn't only the attack. It was what came after. The silence, the fear of reporting, the shame people dump on the survivor, and the reality that too many attackers still walk around freely, while victims carry the weight forever. Then, according to interviews and public reporting, one moment changed everything. A survivor allegedly said something unforgettable. "If only I had teeth down there, not as a joke, not as a slogan, as desperation." And that one sentence became an idea the world couldn't stop talking about. Because Sonnet Ehlers didn't just imagine protection. She imagined consequence. She developed a prototype called Rypak, often described as a device worn internally intended to latch onto an attacker during an assault, causing enough pain and difficulty that the attacker would need medical help to remove it, exposing what had happened. When the concept hit the public, it spread like fire. Headlines called it an anti-rape condom. People online called it brilliant. Others called it terrifying. Because the moment you hear about it, your mind goes to the same place. How bad does the world have to be for this to feel necessary? And that's where the debate exploded. Supporters said women deserve tools to survive. That if society can't guarantee safety, then women should have anything that gives them a fighting chance. But critics raised another fear. What if this makes an attacker even more violent? What if the victim can't use it safely? What if it turns a terrifying situation into something even more unpredictable? Because self-protection devices sound empowering until you picture the risk of retaliation in real time. And then came the internet rumors. For years, posts have claimed rape acts was being mass-produced, handed out widely, available everywhere. But major fact-checkers and reliable reporting have repeatedly pushed back on that, saying it was not widely sold commercially in the way viral posts claimed. And that detail matters, because the true impact of rape acts isn't how many units were sold. It's what the idea revealed about the world. It revealed that millions of people instantly understood the logic. If attackers are not afraid of the law, maybe they'll be afraid of consequences they can't ignore. It also revealed something darker, that survivors are forced to think like engineers just to feel safe. Not how do I heal? Not how do I live again? But how do I stop this from happening to me? Rape acts became controversial, emotional, and polarizing because it lives right in the middle of an impossible truth. We want victims to be safe. We want attackers to be punished. We want justice to work. But when justice feels slow, when safety feels uncertain, people start imagining solutions that bite back. And the most haunting part is this. Even if rape acts never became widely available, the fact that it was invented at all tells you how desperate the world has become for protection that actually works. Number 8. Chiomara, the noble woman who sent a message. This story doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins on a battlefield, a place where law doesn't exist, only power. Chiomara was a Galatian noblewoman living in the 2nd century BCE, in a world where war didn't just decide borders, it decided who was treated like a human being and who was treated like property. In one of Rome's campaigns against the Galatians around 189 BCE, her people were defeated, captives were taken, chains replaced freedom, and Chiomara of a chieftain named Orgeganwas among those prisoners. And then the story turns dark. Ancient sources like Livy and Plutarch describe a Roman centurion placed in charge of captives. He pursued her. She refused, and after rejection, he assaulted her anyway. For the centurion, it wasn't just violence, it was entitlement. That mindset, I won, so I can take what I want. But then something happened that reveals who Chiomara really was. The centurion, either to cover his shame, to soothe his conscience, or simply because greed outweighed guilt, offered a deal. He would return her to her people for a ransom. And in most stories like this, that's the ending. The victim goes home, the attacker disappears into the crowd of war. But Chiomara didn't accept freedom as the final chapter. She turned it into a setup. The agreement was made. A location was chosen. Her people arrived with payment, and as the centurion counted the gold, relaxed, satisfied, believing he was about to profit from his crime, Chiomara gave a signal. Some accounts say it was just a nod. Others say she spoke in her own language. Either way, her men understood. The centurion was killed, and then comes the part that history never forgot. Chiomara took his head back with her caring proof that this wasn't an accident. This was a sentence. She presented it to her husband and reportedly said the line that made her legend. Only one man who had been with her would remain alive. That sentence isn't just revenge. It's a declaration of ownership over her own story. Because in war, women were often used as trophies, proof that an enemy had been conquered, humiliated, erased. Chiomara refused to be that. She refused to be a prize, refused to be something a man could take and then laugh about later. Now, we have to be honest. Chiomara's story comes from ancient writers, and ancient history is mess part fact, part politics, part legend building. But even if time exaggerated the details, the message survives perfectly. Chiomara didn't just go, "Oh man." She made sure the man who harmed her didn't get to walk away untouched. And whether people see it as justice or brutality, Chiomara's name became something rare in ancient storytelling. A woman who wasn't written as helpless. A woman who looked at the world that tried to break her and answered back. And that's why, centuries later, we're still saying her name. Number 7. Lorena Bobbitt. If you grew up in the 90s, you've heard this story. But most people didn't hear it like a tragedy. They heard it like a punchline. A late-night joke, a headline built for shock. A "can you believe this?" moment that turned into entertainment. And that's exactly what makes this case one of the most misunderstood stories in modern true crime history. Because in June of 1993, Lorena Bobbitt said her husband, John Wayne Bobbitt, assaulted her. Later that night, she retaliated an act that caused severe injury and instantly turned their private nightmare into a national spectacle. John was taken to the hospital. His injuries were treated surgically, and Lorena was arrested. And the media couldn't look away. For weeks, it was everywhere. News anchors, talk shows, comedy monologues. People weren't talking about trauma. They were talking about the headline version, the sensational version. But what happened next is what most people forget, because this case wasn't just one trial. It was two. John Wayne Bobbitt was charged with marital sexual assault, and he was later acquitted. And then Lorena went to trial for malicious wounding. In January 1994, the jury found Lorena not guilty by reason of insanity, accepting a defense that she was temporarily insane at the time of the attack. That verdict stunned the courtroom, because it forced the public to consider something they didn't want to say out loud in that era. That marital abuse was real. That marital assault was real. And that sometimes a breaking point doesn't look like a cry for help. It looks like something explosive. Years later, the conversation around Lorena. In 2019, a major docuseries titled Lorena revisited the case and tried to pull it out of the comedy category and back into reality, looking at domestic violence, power, and how media narratives can swallow the truth. And Lorena herself, now known as Lorena Gallo, has spoken publicly about how the world focused on the injury while ignoring the fear she said she lived with. Even decades later, the story still one day stay buried. In 2025, John Wayne Bobbitt gave a new interview reflecting on the incident, showing that no matter how much time passes, this case remains a scar on both sides of the headline. And there's one more detail people often miss. This didn't end when the cameras stopped filming. John Wayne Bobbitt faced later legal trouble, including domestic violence charges years after the original case, which only deepened the reason this story continues to haunt public memory. Because at its core, the Bobbitt case is a warning about what happens when abuse becomes normal, when fear becomes routine, and when the world laughs at a story that should have made it listen. It's one of the clearest examples of how society can turn pain into spectacle. Instead of treating it like the smoke alarm, it really is. Not a headline, a sign that something was terribly wrong, long before the moment everyone remembers. Number 6. The Trying Sisters. Some revenge stories are personal. One victim, one attacker, one moment that shatters everything. But this one is bigger. This is revenge that turns into a revolution. Vietnam. First century, the land is under the control of China's Han Dynasty, and the occupation isn't gentle. It's heavy, it's suffocating. It's built on taxes, forced obedience, and the slow erasing of identity. And in the middle of that pressure, two sisters step forward, Trinh Tric and Trinh No. Today they're remembered as national heroines of Vietnam, symbols of courage carved into history. But their story didn't begin with glory. It began with loss. According to Vietnamese tradition and historical accounts, Trinh Tric was married to a nobleman named Thi Sch, and the occupation authorities, especially the regional Chinese administrator often identified as Su Ding, were known for harsh rule. Then came the moment that lit the fuse. Thi Sch was executed often, described as punishment for resisting or challenging the occupying administration. And after that, Anastra, the sisters stopped negotiating with fear. They stopped trying to survive inside the rules of an empire that didn't respect them. They chose rebellion, and what they did next was almost unimaginable. The Tring sisters gathered forces across the Reganon uprising that Whitney sources often describe as tens of thousands strong, driven by anger, grief, and a hunger for freedom. This wasn't a small riot. This was an army, and what made it even more powerful was that women weren't just present. Women were leading. In Vietnamese cultural memory, the rebellion includes female commanders, female soldiers, and entire communities rising behind two women who refused to kneel. For a moment, it worked. They captured strongholds, they pushed out occupation forces, and Tring Tric is said to have ruled as queen, an image that still holds deep power in Vietnam today. But empires don't forget humiliation. The Han dynasty responded with overwhelming force. A Chinese general named Ma Yuan was sent to crush the rebellion, and after fierce fighting, the uprising was defeated around 43 CE. And the ending, like many ancient endings, comes in different versions. Some accounts say the sisters died in battle. Others say they chose death rather than capture. But no matter which version history preserves, their names survived, because their story isn't remembered as a loss. It's remembered as proof. Proof that oppression can be challenged. Proof that courage can come from grief. And proof that sometimes revenge isn't about one enemy. It's about tearing down the entire system that made the cruelty possible. That's why, even now, nearly 2,000 years later, the Tring sisters are still honored in Vietnam. Not because they were perfect, because they were fearless, and because they made a promise with their actions. If you try to erase us, we will rise. Number 5. The mother who set a rapist on fire. Some revenge stories happen in the heat of the moment. This one didn't. This one waited. It waited through years of grief, through sleepless nights, through the kind of anger that doesn't explode right away, it hardens. This case comes from Spain, and it's often described as one of the most shocking examples of delayed vengeance. Years earlier, a man had been convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl. For the child, the damage was permanent. For the family, life was split into two versions, before and after. And like many cases involving sexual violence, the court process didn't deliver peace, because even when there is a conviction, there is still the reality that the person who caused the pain may someday walk the same streets again. And that's the part that breaks people. Then, years later, the mother reportedly saw him in public. Not in a courtroom, not behind bars, out in the open. And according to witness accounts repeated in reporting, the man didn't just pass by. He taunted her, something as simple as a few words, but loaded like a weapon. A reminder, a brag, a cruel way of saying, I did it, and you can't undo it. And that moment more than anything was the spark, because humiliation is a special kind of trauma. It's not just grief, it's grief. In front of the world, the mother followed him into a bar. A public place, bright lights, people nearby, no hiding. And what happened next was sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. Reports say she poured gasoline on him and lit it right there, with witnesses watching. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't private. It was a statement. A message made out of fire. The man suffered severe burns and later died from his injuries. The mother was arrested, and the case moved from tragedy into national argument, because people didn't react the same way. Some called her a murderona, excuses. Others looked at her and didn't see a criminal. They saw a parent whose life had been destroyed, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. They saw a woman who believed the system had not protected her child the way it should have. And they saw a kind of pain that doesn't speak softly. It screams. It screams. Public reaction was deeply divided. There were also reports of public sympathy and support, even as the legal process treated it as a serious violent crime. And that's what makes this story so unsettling, because it forces a question most people don't like facing: what happens when justice feels incomplete, and the person responsible still gets to live normally when the victim is forced to rebuild, and the attacker gets to keep walking. This isn't a story meant to be celebrated. It's a story meant to be feared, because it shows what grief can become when it has nowhere to go. And it reminds us of something brutal and true. Sometimes, revenge doesn't happen because someone is strong. It happens because someone is shattered, and finally stops caring what happens next. Number 4. Off with his head in an Indian marketplace. This story doesn't unfold in shadows. It explodes into daylight. In 2008, reports from northern India described a scene that stunned everyone who witnessed it and later, everyone who read about it. A crowded marketplace. Ordinary noise. People buying and selling. And then, a woman appeared. According to police statements and news coverage at the time, she arrived covered in blood, holding the severed head of a man she said had just tried to sexually assault her. The market froze. This wasn't a crime discovered later. It wasn't something whispered about. It was a moment that turned public space into a crime scene. Witnesses described panic and disbelief. People scattered. Some screamed. Others stood in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Police moved in quickly, and when they questioned the woman, her explanation was simple, almost flat. She said the man had attacked her while she was alone, and a struggle followed. She said she fought back. She said she refused to let him overpower her. There was no dramatic speech, no attempt to flee, just a claim of survival, delivered in the most extreme way imaginable. The story spread fast, not because people celebrated it, but because they didn't know what to feel. Even the reporting itself carried a heavy tone. This wasn't framed as triumph. It was framed as horror. Because the image was impossible to separate from the larger reality India was already confronting at the time, a national conversation about sexual violence, safety, and how often women felt trapped between fear and silence. This case landed like a warning flare. It forced people to ask questions no one wants to ask. What happens when someone believes help is too far away? When there's no time to run? When survival feels like a split-second decision? The legal system moved forward. Investigations followed. Facts were examined, but the image never left public memory. Because this wasn't just about one woman and one attacker. It was about a breaking point, a moment so extreme that it stripped away all distance between danger and response. And that's why this story remains unsettling. Not because it was violent, but because it revealed how close fear and fury can sit next to each other when someone believes they have no other way out. Number 3. Honor restored in Turkey. This story doesn't just involve violence, it involves fear that lives inside a person. Month after month, until it feels like there's no air left to breathe. In 2012, Turkish media reported a case that shocked the public partly because of what happened, but mostly because of what the woman said afterward. She was pregnant, and she was arrested after being accused of killing a man she claimed had been assaulting her and blackmailing her for months. Not a stranger, someone who allegedly had access to her life, someone who, according to her statement, didn't just hurt her physically, but tried to control her with shame. Reports said she claimed he threatened to expose intimate photos, something she feared would ruin her relationships, her reputation, and her family's standing. And this is where the word honor enters the story. Not honor as dignity, but honor as social punishment. Because in some communities, a woman can be treated like the crime is hers to carry. Like she is the problem, like she is the scandal, like survival itself is a stain, and that kind of pressure becomes its own cage. According to the reports, after the killing, she left the man's severed head in a public square. It was horrifying. But it was also deliberate, because leaving it in public wasn't just violence. It was a statement. It was her forcing the town, forcing society to look directly at the things she said had been done to her in secret. When questioned, she reportedly described him as someone who played with her honor. That phrase carried everything. The humiliation, The threat of exposure, the sense that her life could be destroyed with a rumor or an image. Authorities arrested her, and the case immediately sparked furious debate. Some people focused only on the brutality and said nothing could justify it. Others cooled and stopped thinking about what she claimed was happening behind closed doors and how long she said she had been trapped. Because whether people agreed with her actions or not, the story exposed something real. When a society punishes victims socially, when people treat them like they're dirty or ruined, some victims stop believing there's a safe way out. And when escape feels impossible, desperation starts feeling like the only door left open. This isn't a story to admire. It's a story to fear, because it shows how blackmail and shame can become weapons, and how quickly survival can twist into something extreme, when someone believes the world will destroy them either way. Number 2. Phoolan Devi. The Bandit Queen. Some stories feel like they were written to warn a society about itself. Phoolan Devi's life is one of them. Not because it's simple, but because it's the kind of story where every choice is shaped by a world stacked against you. She was born in India in 1963, in a poor rural village, into a low-caste familia label that, in many places, didn't just describe status. It described how much suffering the world expected you to accept in silence. From the beginning, her life was defined by power who had it, who didn't, and what people thought they could do to someone like her. Accounts of her early life describe abuse, forced circumstances, and a childhood that was never allowed to feel safe. And then, as a teenager, she was married off, another reminder that her body and future weren't really considered hers. But Phoolan didn't stay quiet. She resisted, and resistance, in her world, came with consequences. Over time, she became caught up with bandits, outlaws, who lived outside the rules because the rules were never built for them to survive. But Phoolan's story wasn't romantic. It was brutal. She was kidnapped. She was beaten, and she was sexually assaulted repeatedly, an experience that became central to how her story is documented and remembered. For weeks, she lived through something that doesn't end when it stops happening. It keeps happening afterward. Endure sleep. Endure nervous in your ability to trust the world. And this is where her legend begins to split into 2 versions. In one version, Phoolan Devi disappears into trauma. In the other, she turns into a storm. She rises into power among the bandits and becomes a leader someone feared, followed, hunted. Not because she was born violent, but because survival pushed her into a role where violence was currency. Then came Bema. In 1981, her gang was linked to the killing of around 20 men in the village of Bemayanavan that would become one of the most infamous massacres in modern Indian history. Many accounts connect this massacre to revenge, for humiliation, for assault, for caste cruelty. It became the moment the country couldn't ignore her anymore. To some, she became a monster. To others, she became a symbol of what happens when a person is abused until they stop believing mercy exists. And then, something unexpected happened. Phoolan Devi surrendered. She spent over a decade in prison, her life moving from outlaw legend to legal reality. But her story still wasn't finished, because after prison, she stepped into politics. The same society that once hunted her now watched her win a seat in parliament, something almost impossible to imagine if you only knew the headline version of her life. And for a while, it looked like she'd rewritten her ending. A poor, low-caste girl who survived violence, becoming a national figure. But revenge has a shadow, and shadows return. In 2001, Phoolan Devi was assassinated in New Delhi, killed by men who claimed it was retaliation for Bemay. And wheat taught her life closed, the way it began, with violence deciding the rules. Even today, her story is still debated. Some call her a hero of the oppressed, someone who forced the country to look at caste brutality and gendered violence. Others call her a criminal who crossed lines that can never be But the reason her name still echoes is simple. Phoolan Devi became a symbol of what happens when violence, caste, and gender oppression collide, and a person stops believing the world will ever save them. Because sometimes the system doesn't just fail someone. Sometimes it creates the very thing it fears. Number 1. Boudica Some names don't fade. They don't shrink into the footnotes of history. They don't disappear under the dust of centuries. They burn. And Boudica is one of those names. A warrior queen remembered not just for how she fought, but for what she refused to accept. This story takes us to ancient Britain, 1st century CE. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni, a powerful Celtic tribe living under the shadow of the Roman Empire. Rome didn't just conquer with swords. It conquered with humiliation, with punishment, with the slow destruction of identity. For a time, Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, managed to keep a fragile peace with the Romans. And then he died. And what happened next is the moment the story turns into fire. Prasutagus left behind wealth and territory, and some accounts say he tried to protect his family by naming Rome as a co-heir. But Rome dedunti come to honor agreements. Rome came to take. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Romans seized Iceni land, abused the people, and treated them as conquered property. And then the most horrifying detail. Tacitus reports that Boudica was publicly flogged, and her daughters were assaulted. That wasn't only violence. That was a message. A deliberate attempt to break a queen in front of her people. To prove that even royalty could be reduced to nothing. But instead of breaking her, Rome created its own nightmare. Boudica did what empires fear most. She turned humiliation into unity. She rallied the Iceni. Then allied tribes joined people who were already starving under Roman rule, already furious, already waiting for a spark. And Boudica became that spark. Ancient sources describe her as tall, fierce, commanding more than a leader, a force. And when she moved, the rebellion moved with her. Roman towns fell, settlements burned, and one of the greatest symbols of her revolt was the destruction of Landinium the Reli Roman, settlement that would one day become London. This wasn't a small uprising. It was a violent shockwave that sent panic through Roman Britain. For a moment, it looked like the empire might actually lose, but Rome responded the way Rome always responded, with overwhelming force. The governor Suetonius Paulinus gathered troops, chose the battlefield, and crushed the rebellion. Boudica was defeated, and her final fate depends on the version you hear. Some accounts suggest she died by poison. Others imply she died in the aftermath. But history didn't bury her, because even in defeat, Boudica became immortal. For nearly 2,000 years, her name has survived as a symbol of resistance. Not just revenge, but defiance against empire, against humiliation, against terror. And that's why her story still matters. Because none of these stories are clean, none of them are easy, and none of them should ever be taken as a blueprint. But they reveal something people don't always want to face. When survivors feel unheard, when they feel unprotected, when they feel mocked. Some stop waiting for help. The real goal isn't revenge. It's a world where no one has to even imagine it.